Okay. And so now this is kind of part two of our discussion uh, the marginalists and what they're contributing to here. So in the very first one, we just kind of talked about Jevons, Menger, and Walras, and just how these three individuals represented the introduction of marginalist thought into um, our understanding of economics. But again, it wasn't these three people that came up with it first. They really owe a great deal to both Bentham, who focused on this idea of utility, but also Ricardo, who did focus on that idea of going back to the idea of doing things marginally. So Jevons, Menger, and Walras, what they did is they focused on production. And what that required for us was a bit of a discussion of what that would mean, how we would start to take that a little bit further, um, uh, and actually, for the first time here, actually take it to the United States, which at the time was really not a center of economic thought in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. And what you get is John Bates Clark, which is our focus here for part of chapter 15 as well. Clark isn't the only person. We've got Bohm-Bawerk, Edgeworth, Wicksteed, and Wicksell. All these are important accounts, but we're going to focus here primarily on Clark, John Bates Clark. I've worked with his archival papers pretty closely because one of the key things that John Bates Clark did is he helped form the American Economics Association, which is actually where most of my research, archival research, is oriented around. So every spring, I go to the archives at Duke University, which is where the papers of the American Economic Association, AEA, are held, which is what was created by John Bates Clark. And John Bates Clark is important because one of his students was Thorsten Veblen, who we'll look at in chapter 19. So we've got these kinds of connections here, and in terms of what John Bates Clark did, he focused again, just as the other economists did, on this idea of the marginal utility, which had been developed by the marginalists, but he looked specifically and focused specifically on how that influenced the price. And what he took from that was the creation of a book, The Distribution of Wealth. And he really wanted to look at this idea of, again, how are things going to be distributed in society. To show as kind of this quote here kind of emphasized here, to show that the distribution of income of society is controlled by natural law, and that this law would give to every agent of production the amount of wealth that agent creates. Right. So we've got the distribution of wealth created, linked to its production. That it's only when we're faced with these competitive markets that each factor of production, the factors of production being primarily labor and capital, that these factors of production receive according to what they're contributing to the overall production. Clark is basically the very first individual to give us a very direct challenge to that Marxian notion of the production process. Clark, to do this, is basically then responding to how Marx viewed the world. And that Clark, to do this, is looking at, has to make a few assumptions. Assumptions that, to be honest, exist to this day when you take a Principles of Economics course. and that would be that labor and capital are substitutable. So it gives us a way to create these isoquants, these production functions across individuals. That in the short run, production of something, that one of the factors is fixed, be it either labor or capital. In the United States, we're generally assuming that the capital is fixed in quantity, at least in the short run. We don't distinguish between the quality of the labor inputs, so basically each labor input is viewed equally, as the people are equally skilled, and that there's competition in these markets, which generally get us a pretty consistent, consistently found price. And so this would be kind of a typical picture that you see in a principles course, where basically you could look at the marginal productivity of labor, holding the capital fixed, and that basically as you use more and more workers, right, as we go along the x-axis from left to right, the productivity of those workers declines, which would then mean for the graph on the right, the value of the marginal productivity of labor, the value of what they're producing would also be falling. This diminishing marginal returns to labor, that's something that Clark presents at the American Economic Association meetings in 1888. Essentially, it underlies the entire field of labor economics as it kind of exists today. And that the value of their marginal productivity of labor, that VMPL, that's in turn determining what their wages, can be. Now look at that. Understand how different that is than how Marx was even talking about it? I'm not trying to pass judgment here of who's right, who's wrong. But I'm saying you've got the same concept, how do we determine what people get paid for the things that they do? And yet we've got two very different understandings here. From Clark, it is that people are paid according to the value of their marginal productivity of labor. And that for Marx, we have that workers are paid basically a subsistence wage, which doesn't have any direct connection to the value of what they're producing, the value of their marginal productivity. In the economics classroom that we have today, we focus on, determining the wage rate based on, or determining the wage rate, determining how many workers will be hired based on what that productivity is. Where the firm is trying to maximize their profit, which is going to also then require that they maximize their levels of production. And that essentially when we look at, in a labor economics course, we basically have the graph on the left here, but then when we look in the field of industrial organization, or even in an intermediate microeconomics course, we can see that for the firm, which is trying to decide between how much to devote to wages versus how much to devote to interest that they pay for capital and whatnot, we can determine that breakdown of what they pay for wages versus what they pay for capital investments. And we see this today, and still used, obviously, today. For Clark, what becomes important for him as well is that equilibrium in the labor market would also generate for us efficiency in the overall market, because it's only with that kind of efficiency that the output can be maximized. So workers being paid their equilibrium wage and the equilibrium quantity of workers existing means that we're going to maximize how much production is occurring. Again, workers, at least for the Clark notion here, you're not going to have any exploitation here. That's really not part of the equation. it's really a discussion of workers being paid their marginal productivity and workers not remaining with an employer if they're not paid according to their productivity. Again, that's assuming that there's that level of competition that Marx probably didn't assume existed as clearly. Okay, so I'm just going to skip this here because it's just the same as the capital markets are just the same. That same discussion exists for capital as it exists for labor. So this is under labor being fixed. This was under capital being fixed. And so this, if you've taken an intermediate microeconomics course, this is the end conclusion that we get in intermediate microeconomics, which basically makes it a 140, 150-year-old idea. That each factor of production, the two factors being labor and capital, that each of those factors are paid according to their marginal productivities, what they produce for everyone. So in the third bullet point here, just to kind of distinguish it even further from Marx, those who own the capital are not the bosses. There's no two classes of people. People and employers, that's not really the case. There are employers, but the employer is basically stuck with a managerial decision of, do I use workers, do I use capital, or what combination of the two do I use to produce this thing that I'm producing? Which generates the question for us then of what is profits? Profits for Clark are basically a residual. And that residual is what we basically would see would be something, profits are generated when we get a return that's greater than the normal rate of return to capital. Which basically would mean that we earn enough extra money so that I can replace things for depreciation. And then with that extra bit of money, I'm able to expand my business, or even just purchase more capital. And that there's an extent to which there is some entrepreneurship, but that would just be the profits that come from any entrepreneurship would just be a reward that one gets for taking a risk. And so Clark, at some point, right, he's trying to deal with, again, Marx's right, because at this point in time, Marx's fourth and last volume of Capital would be coming out. And, he understands that, you can look around the world and it certainly doesn't seem very equal for everyone. But any of that inequality just exists because either we do have some monopolies or monopsonies, so maybe in reality we don't have that perfect competition that he was assuming. And that also people are, don't all start off at the same position. Some people are born into a family of great wealth, and so they obviously have advantages over those who don't have as much wealth. Which would mean that if we're talking about the distribution of income or the distribution of wealth, which is the original title of his text, you're not going to get equal distribution of things if you don't start off with equal distribution of things. The two aren't going to work with each other. And so at this time, at the turn of the 20th century, the concern as well was about this idea that monopolies existed and that firms were becoming bigger and bigger. And so Clark, in Essentials of Economics from 1907, tries to deal with this idea that firms are becoming bigger and bigger, and as they reduce competition, that it might cause some problems with pricing behavior. Okay. The other kinds of things that we see here as we kind of deal with Clark's marginal productivity theory. That if we look at this residual, typically we don't really, if you've taken intermediate microeconomics, we don't really talk about profit existing over the long run. That basically everything is divided into capital rents and labor wages. And so that's why we saw with those two pictures that we get that wage rectangle and that we get that residual triangle. And we would have that for both the labor market, and then we would have one for the capital market. Okay, so with that said, part of the controversy that others bring out, like Wicksteed and others, and Bohm-Bawerk will as well, is that Clark did make some assumptions that others didn't feel comfortable making. One of those being that we would exhaust the supply of products, and that's not generally going to be the case, right? We're not going to use all of the workers or all of the capital that exists. And we don't even know if they would be exhausted, even if factors of production were paid according to their marginal productivity. This is getting a little bit technical here, but I just want you to know that even though Clark's theory does underlie most of modern microeconomic thought, it wasn't exactly uncontroversial, that there was some controversy involved. I'm going to skip these two slides here about Wicksteed. Originally, when I was making these slides, I thought I wanted to talk about him, and you see this kind of discussion as well in intermediate micro. You can look at the slides if you want to, but I'll let you kind of decide if you want to look at some of the work of Wicksteed. What Clark concludes, and which is what intermediate microeconomic thought concludes, is that there are no profits in the long run. Everything, generally speaking, defaults to perfect competition where there are no profits. Clark, as we look around us, we see that certainly doesn't seem to be the actual existence of things. So that gives rise in the 1920s to industrial organization theory, where we talk about this a bit more methodically. For Marx, the whole idea, so whereas Clark is focusing on that there is no excess, that there is no surplus, for Marx, remember, just to kind of contrast it, the surplus always existed. That was the nature of the capitalist system, is that there was a surplus, because that surplus was exploited and stolen from the worker. The neoclassical economist basically says, not really the case. In the long run, the surplus doesn't exist. Bohm-Bawerk gets us kind of that more detailed explanation. But again, since originally when I made these slides, I wanted to talk about it, but since the textbook doesn't, at least in chapters 15, 16, and 17, doesn't talk about Wicksteed or Bohm-Bawerk, why don't I just kind of skip that for right now? So I'm just going to skip this as well based on that. Okay, so what that gives for us here is this final issue then of just talking about how do we measure capital. This becomes a debate that rages throughout the 20th century, right? Because from Clark, we now know then that capital is important to talk about. It generates rents, which are then contrasted with individuals, working for labor. Well, Joan Robinson, Piero Sraffa have to talk about how do we measure this capital, and how do we determine what this mode of production, means of production, how do we measure how it is compensated? Robinson and Sraffa I mean, sometimes capital is easy to think about. If it's a physical machine, a physical conveyor belt, a truck, and so we would measure these capital things by just looking at what the price is that we pay for them. But the problem is that if you use the price as your way of measuring how much capital you have, then you're typically unable to show how the productivity of that capital is related to its price. Let me just give you an example, right? I have a desktop computer. I think the desktop computer costs $500, right? But it makes me an incredibly more productive scholar, right? So when I mean, my wife sometimes complains to me that like I have too many computers, but from my perspective, you know what? $200, $300 for a computer is a very small investment if I have one at my home and one at my office, because it makes me so much more productive worker. That the price of the good itself, the capital good, isn't related to how what my productivity is. And so for Schraffa, that's what gets us this idea of re-switching, which basically just says that there's a breakdown between the price of the factor and its productivity, and that this happens can happen in different industries based on what the capital labor ratios are. And so Schraffa talks about this idea that we would switch back from labor-intensive techniques to capital-intensive techniques depending on what the interest rate is and how much of an incentive different capital goods, how much of an incentive you would have to buy those capital goods. Okay, and then the final thing here, and I'm just kind of expanding now beyond the slides here because this is the last slide. Chapter 16 was a rather short chapter, but it was just trying to emphasize what influence Alfred Marshall had on the discipline. And he is, Alfred Marshall is important to recognize here because much of what we learn in economics today at the introductory level comes from, at its source, from both Walras, Clark, and Marshall. Marshall wrote the very first popular economics textbook, Principles of Economics, in 1890. He influenced Joan Robinson, who I just had talked about, John Maynard Keynes. He was the person that these people relied on for their first introduction to what economics was. He's the person, Marshall's the person who gives us that assumption that we use quite often in economics of ceteris paribus, holding everything equal. And he starts to use that, this tendency of things being laws, like law of diminishing marginal utility, law of demand, law of supply. These weren't immutable laws, rather they were just tendencies of how things typically tend to work out. For Marshall, he's the person that really gets us that first extensive discussion of demand. He draws for us that demand curve that people get introduced to for the first time. Think about what I just said there. It is Marshall who gets us the law of demand. It is Marshall who draws out the demand for the first time. It is Marshall who gives us that relationship between the price and the quantity demanded, and gives us a demand function where the quantity is determined by the price of the good, income, number of buyers, taxes, price of substitute goods, price of complementary goods. That all comes from Marshall. And what also comes from Marshall are the ideas of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus, right, which is typically what you learn right after discussing supply and demand. So Marshall is an important, and then the final thing would be is that when we talk about elasticity, Marshall is also the contributor to understanding that. So, Marshall, I didn't make a separate set of slides for him, but I still wanted us to cover his chapter. And the reason why his chapter was just so very important was because much of what we learn in economics today, certainly at the introductory level, all comes from his work some 140 years ago. Okay.